This is RevTech Podcast, where we discuss everything from business processes to measurement and technical alignment. The RevTech mission focuses on effectively managing and optimizing the go-to-market strategy through methodologies, tools, and best practices. We discuss the success criteria and technical fit guides for decision-making and ensure solutions align with the business goals. So, in this episode, our guest is Paul Kiggen, founder of Revora. Very happy today that we have this session because we're starting to branch out and we're trying to bring more services into our podcast. So welcome, Paul. I'm looking forward to have this conversation about the services you and your company is providing, and also in general, how the go-to-market services look like. So welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Paul, it's great to have you. And thanks for being our first person to go on the services side. So yeah, let's, the same way we do on the tech side, just jump in and hear a little bit about Revora and what you guys are and kind of the elevator pitch.
Sure. Yeah. So at Revora, we provide revenue operations as a service. So really what that means is that we specialize in optimizing and scaling revenue processes, typically for B2B companies. So, and they're often in their early stage of growth. So we do this by integrating strategy, technology, data, and we really do that just to drive sustainable, repeatable growth with those companies. We combine strategic consulting and hands-on implementation. We work with them directly on go-to-market strategy, CRM management, lead gen, data analytics and reporting, growth modeling, capacity planning, you name it, right? So all these things. And we essentially act as an extension of teams, really just to drive that growth and operational efficiencies. So what companies get with working with us, they really get access to a full team of revenue operations experts, and basically to get on-demand, flexible, and at a fraction of the cost of a full-time hire.
Yeah. And I'm excited to see some of the use cases and dive in further there. But first, I want to know like a little bit more about you and your co-founder, Till, of like, what were you doing before? I think you had more of a RevOps background. It looks like, if I in stalking his LinkedIn, Till had a little bit more of like an entrepreneur venture background. But I'm curious, how did you two meet? What were you doing before? What kind of motivated you to start the company?
Till and I go way back. So we met in college originally and then kind of went our own different ways. So I kind of grew up in the typical revenue operations career path, if you will. So started out as a business analyst, then moved into CRM management, then started leading sales ops, and then eventually RevOps for kind of large corporations, large organizations, B2B SaaS. And Till grew up more in the startup world. He's kind of the expert in the sales and marketing aspect. So number one, we had a pretty good connection there, right? We have a pretty different skill sets that we bring to the market. And I just saw a pretty big gap, in, especially with working with smaller companies, in just the way they approach RevOps in general, right? So typically what we see is that they try to hire one person, if they invest in RevOps at all, and then have that person essentially do strategy, architecture, the data engineering, building the infrastructure, all of that. And it's very, very hard to find one person that can do all of that. So that was kind of the gap that we were seeing.
Inexpensive.
It's very expensive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just typically an underinvestment in revenue operations. And that was kind of the gap that we were trying to close with revenue operations as a service, because then we give them access to a full team of RevOps experts without having to necessarily have everybody full-time in a position, in seat in the company, but they really just on demand get access to the resources that they need to build and scale the company at an early growth stage.
And I know you do a lot of the setup and implementation. Will you stay on with a company and like help them for a longer period of time in a fractional way, or?
Typically, as kind of
Yeah.
as needed. So we usually come in at a kind of Series A, Series B, early stage. We work primarily with either the founder, if they have a VP of sales or commercial leader in place already, then we work very closely with them. And then we stay on and just kind of on demand give access to the resources that they need. And then in some
Yeah.
cases, we also help them hire if they want to have a full position, if they get to that stage where it's like, hey, now we do really need somebody full time in this position for the company. Then we kind of help them place those resources. And then at some point, we kind of drop off when they feel like they've been fully supported and they can kind of stand on their own that way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like my dream, not in RevOps. Maybe that's Demetrius's dream, but like in partnerships or business development, like I want to set it all up and I want to get it to like a good spot and then I want to leave. So
Yeah.
that's a good place to be. Always working on something new there. And so, how long has Revora been around? When did you guys found the company?
About a year ago at this point.
Okay.
So fairly young. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And how is scaling that going? Like, have you brought on more team members? Do you work with consultants or, independent contractors? Or what does it look like to actually scale out this RevOps organization?
Yeah, primarily with independent contractors. So we have a pretty broad network, both Till and I, with people that we worked with in the past or people that are always looking for sometimes an interim opportunity to work on something on one project because it is a little bit more fragmented, right? A kind of a fractional placement of RevOps experts in that way. So yeah, that's how we've been scaling, just really kind of working with contractors and placing them in projects, doing the implementation or doing the execution for those companies in the RevOps space that they needed. And then again, like kind of pull out once they feel like they've got it. But with a lot of these companies, we kind of stay on, and then it does become more of a kind of a finding and hiring service that we provide as well. So we help them recruit RevOps talent to kind of stay there longer. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you kind of identify like who your first couple clients were and has that process changed at all? My assumption is like you knew some companies and people at companies that needed some help, but as you've, grown, have you had a different approach to identifying new potential customers?
Yeah, pretty typical, I think. Starting out a company, working with our network, people that we knew that needed either some implementation or they just needed some extra help in some cases,
Yep.
right? They didn't have the bandwidth really to kind of deliver on the growth expectations that they had in the company. So we helped them out in a fractional way. And then we started looking kind of outwards, right? So outside of our own network. So a lot of our new customers right now come through LinkedIn. We try to be pretty active there in terms of connecting to new people, broadening our network. Try to hopefully deliver like a lot of content and new ideas and fresh perspectives in the revenue operations space that are very interesting for CROs, VPs of sales, the people that we sell to. And then we do of course a little bit of email marketing. We do some calling and try to be kind of where they are as well. Try to meet
Yeah.
them where they are.
Yeah, and you'd
So
mentioned like Series B, Series C, and then early stage and helping build things out, which I think is great. Whenever I'm like in any service company, I'm like, I love to see how much educational content they're putting out, right? Because I think that's like the best marketing you can do is to be giving a resource that people can use. And then they're like, oh, these people know what they're talking about. Like, let me go and chat with them when they need help.
yeah.
There's a bunch of, RevOps, go-to-market strategy, service providers out there. Who do you really think about as like your competitors or who do you run into in this space? I'm sure some of it is like the competitors, they do want to hire that RevOps person to come in versus using external resources. But how do you think about the competitive landscape for your company?
Yeah, there's certainly other RevOps as a service providers. We're not alone in that space. There's some people that have been doing that for a couple of years and do that really well. Definitely some larger agency type companies, Lean Scale, Union Square Consulting. There's a couple of people there. Go Nimbly is a pretty big agency as well. So those are kind of like the more established names. The founders there are also really good at putting out very helpful, valuable content. They have a large network, so they're very active on LinkedIn as well. You kind of see them all over the place. And that's great, right? So those are people you kind of look up to, kind of seeing, hey, what are they doing in the space? How are they growing? That's definitely some of the competitors that we look into. Other than that, it's really kind of whenever we go through a sales process and if they're evaluating their revenue operations needs and we are talking to them and they're talking to some other providers as well, some of the other things that we run into is that in a lot of cases they stay status quo, right? So and we're not alone in that kind of objection and in that sales process. There's a lot of companies that deal with that. It's not just revenue operations as a service, but it's just companies that say, well, you know what, we feel that we have a need, we want to make the investment, but right now it's not the budget, right now it's not the time. Let's just keep going how we're going right now, see if we can kind of make it work a little bit longer, and then we'll reach back out. So we see that a lot too. So it's not necessarily they go to a competitor for, ABC reason. They just stay with whatever they have today.
Sounds like the biggest competitor is status quo. I've heard that before.
Yeah, because the thing is, like the work still gets done, right, by somebody in the company. That's typically the thing when companies don't have RevOps, they still have somebody that does their systems. They still have somebody to run reports, to do the analytics, to help build the strategy. It's usually not the best person to do it because oftentimes what we see is that their CRO, their VP of sales, one of our most expensive resources gets pulled into doing these reporting and analytics, these executional tasks that RevOps typically does and does a lot better and a lot faster than they do. But it's just somebody needs to do it in the company, right? So until they make that decision that revenue operations needs to come in, they want to make that investment, somebody still does it. It's the way we typically find.
It is crazy to me how often operations and like analytics and building a solid foundation there is overlooked by companies. And just the cost and loss that you get from either people's time that could be really strategic, having to do kind of like lower level work and spend their time and energy on it, or just data being missed. And I think like getting that foundation right is so important. And as new technologies coming out, we talk to these tech vendors all the time that are bringing new technology that can help you do stuff. It's like you need someone who's helping to think through how to implement those things. What's the best systems to set up? But it's very overlooked. Curious if that will evolve over the next few years with AI and whatnot. We shall see.
I want to hear what Paul really thinks about this, but I think one of the major reasons why companies are not hiring RevOps or operations in general early enough is because they struggle with defining what's the value behind this. I think it's just somewhere in the mix of different roles that they need to bring initially. They think that everyone can do something extra. But when you throw more of the extra stuff on these people, there's a tipping point in the day-to-day work when they start realizing I can't do my primary job because I'm doing a lot of other stuff. And, some people recognize it early, some people just drag it to the moment when it's so painful that people start leaving, right?
Yep.
And I think that's one of the reasons, but I don't think it's the only reason. That's the moment when they start realizing, okay, we got to bring somebody in. And we don't want to start with something that is heavy, so we're going to throw some system stuff on them, right? Or this unwanted abandoned child called sales compensation.
Hmm.
So these are the typical suspects that just start to accelerate in the conversation in this circumstance. But I think it doesn't have to be that way. If the companies are cognizant that this work eventually will prevail on, engineering side or marketing side, suddenly engineers doing comp, man, that's a wrong combination.
Hmm. Yep.
You don't want your engineer to do the comp. That's first of all, that's very expensive. Second is the guys coming or the gals coming to work every single day, and they just hate it. There's only few people I know, they love comp. And these are ops people.
Mhm.
So I can't even expect that engineer person will love it.
My least favorite time of the year is when we're redoing our comp plans, and I'm like,
There you go. I mean, there's nobody in the world that is just fully sane that says, I love comp. If you say this, I mean, already like, okay, I'm not sure I want to have you in my phone book.
Mhm.
All right. So yeah, Paul, what is your take on this? Why do you see this?
Yeah, absolutely. And just on comp specifically, that can also be, like you said, very expensive to have a person do that who shouldn't be doing that, number one. But then there's also a risk built in, right? If mistakes get made because people that shouldn't really be doing it do it, salespeople don't get paid out, but they should be paid out. If you have a very complex comp plan or maybe a very complex sales organization, then you might also risk litigation, right? And lawsuits and people leaving on bad terms. And it just leads to a whole set of problems that you don't want to have just on comp alone. But you brought up systems admin and infrastructure and all these different things that need to get done. If they get done kind of by different people in different places at different times, you end up with a lot of tech debt usually because you get different systems at different times that solve a certain problem that needs to be solved at that moment, which is great. Bringing on a tool is pretty easy these days, right? You go to a website, in some cases, literally swipe your credit card, you got a couple seats, you're up and going. Integration is pretty easy with a lot of systems and tools as well. But if you get a lot of these systems set up, they don't integrate well, they don't talk to each other. They don't operate on a structured layer of data that goes kind of across your entire revenue operations architecture and infrastructure. Then you're going to miss out on opportunities. You're going to miss out on visibility into your pipeline, into your conversion rates, into your attribution, all these things that you're just going to miss if you just don't have it organized from a centralized point, which typically revenue operations is that, right? Is that point in the middle that sits between marketing and sales, customer success, finance, product, and it kind of brings all of those teams together to operate on a centralized layer of data to make decisions on, to really get the company to a shared revenue target that everybody is then tasked with essentially to hit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're essentially saying, Paul, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that you're gonna spend that money one way or another. You can have a choice. You can go with the one way, old way, where you're gonna spend it and you spend a lot, and you can just try to what you think is a risk, but hire people that actually will keep you honest on that front, and you very like you're gonna spend something, but you won't spend as much.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, and even if you have we had this happen recently where, RevOps people leave the business and it's like, does anyone know how to do this? It's like, no, that person knew how to do it. And that is the benefit of, working with someone like yourself because okay, there's someone hired, they leave. It's like, okay, well, we're onboarding someone else. Like, can you come in and help us again and help us like get going again? It's kind of like a safety net with any employee retention or churn there, so
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too, because there's really two different scenarios that we just talked about, right? One is they don't really hire anybody at all. There's no investment in RevOps. They just kind of spread out the different tasks, the different team members, and it still gets done one way or the other because it has to get done. We have to report on our numbers. We have to report on the bookings, revenue growth targets. Are we hitting them? Yes or no? But then a lot of cases, what we see, especially in earlier stage companies, is when they do make eventually the investments in RevOps, what we typically see is that they hire a very junior person, typically a system admin type role, because that is usually the first thing that needs to be taken care of, right? The CRM needs to be implemented. The data needs to be somewhat clean. People need to be able to work with it because that's how we record bookings. That's how eventually also people get compensated. But that person then also gets tasked with all of the other things in terms of strategy and architecture, data reporting, and then oftentimes that one person, the RevOps team of one, gets burned out after a time. As you alluded to that, Dimitris, that happens a lot. Then that person leaves. All that knowledge, if that isn't documented well in the organization, is lost then as well. And it is hard. I get it because you're not going to necessarily spend $500,000 building the entire revenue operation structure if you haven't really invested in your sales team yet, or you don't have your marketing team yet, right? If you don't have those components, people don't often see the need to first invest in revenue operations before anything else. It's usually things pile up, let's add another person. Things pile up, let's add another person, and it kind of keeps
Yeah.
repeating that same process. And that's, I think, where revenue operations as a service, not to pitch the service again, but that's, I think, where that could be potentially a solution, right? Because you don't necessarily need a full-time architect and somebody doing infrastructure. You might only need a couple hours here or there to make sure that everything is clean, structured, and supports the business. You might not need somebody to do compensation full time, right? But it would be helpful to have an expert in that or somebody that
Yep,
works with compensation technology there. So
yeah.
there's all these examples where you can kind of plug in fractionally that allows you to leverage your team a lot more than just having that one junior system admin that you task with everything RevOps.
Everything.
It's almost like a slice of bread, right? You know, you start with something small, and eventually you're adding more and more and more and more as the company in parallel is growing, and it's just adding more of their capacity, better product, more customers, right? More employees. and then you're adding another notch, and then so on, so on. So it's an evolution as you go with the company until they get to a point. Yeah, they're ready. They can have a full blown in house team that's costing them, I don't know, $2 million, right? Go ahead.
Yep.
Right? If that's what you can afford and you can really see the value, because probably by then you will. Yeah, be my guest. Makes a lot of sense.
Do we want to dive into the use case? I want to hear.
Yes. I think
Yeah.
we're going to be bitching a little bit more later in the market trends about a couple of things. I'm pretty sure. Paul, what do you want to share with us?
So yeah, one company we recently worked with was a very interesting use case for us, just because it was very very early on. Right, the founder came to us with basically an idea, didn't really have a product yet. Did have an established business already with a lot of clients that are providing value for through a kind of a service model there as well, consulting. But now they wanted to essentially build a product that's a standalone company and go to market with that. They just didn't really have any real experience doing that. So that's where we came in. We helped them developing the product, doing the market research, getting the MVP ready, getting a couple of early stage clients on board, doing the iteration, building the product out that way with client feedback, and building it eventually for scale. We helped them with their go to market strategy. We helped them with their infrastructure. We set up their CRM system, their sales process. So we helped them with all of those things to make sure that they were ready when they were ready to make investments into this, to then be ready to scale this product. It's a product in the public sector, which is interesting as well, because it was new for both myself and for Till. And it's essentially a dashboard for city officials and government officials, city managers, economic development directors in that space that are looking to have essentially all the data that they use in their day-to-day work. So commercial real estate data, residential real estate data, workforce and jobs data, foot traffic, all this information kind of come together in one place so they can operate and make decisions for their cities on a local level in an informed way. And then the company that we work with, they also then provide their specific insights on what the data tells them so that the city manager has a very clear and complete picture of what's going on in their local economy. I can show that if you want, if you share my screen.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, you don't hear a lot about public sector innovate on the front end of RevOps. So kudos to you that you actually took it on and you have a great partner on the other side. I want to learn more.
I find it myself really interesting as well. The kind of urban planning and economic development sector in cities. It's very local level, right? So it's working with local entrepreneurs, local grants, and so we essentially give the cities access to all of this. So it's essentially this overview. It's a tool that we built with them, very similar to some of the dashboards really that we built in RevOps for other companies to give them access to all of their marketing, sales, customer success data, tracking all the KPIs that the companies typically do in a dashboard. We built something similar for cities, really. So, you get your commercial real estate data that they look into, like occupancy rate, vacancy rates, right? So they can kind of see that. And this really is a blend between public data that's available. So, for example, workforce, unemployment rates, things like that is available publicly, right? So cities can already access that. And some of this is private data that the company that we work with acquires that data essentially and makes it available to cities that they sign on through a partnership model essentially.
It's such an interesting use case because this is a CRM system, for cities. It's like, how do we take all of this data that we have, in the MarTech world? It's like your sales calls and your CRM data and your marketing data and all this stuff and put it together. And this is like the exact same concept just for public and city data.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and this is something I learned too. Cities really, I mean, it is a public sector, but they do operate as a business. A city manager is essentially the equivalent of a CEO of a company, right? They have a budget. They have to make sure that it's not for profit, but they do have to make sure that their P&L adds up at the end of the year, and they have to make sure that they can work with the funds that are available, the resources that are available, and that's essentially the thought behind this: is to give them access to all this data so they become more,
Better business managers.
yeah,
Yeah.
they have a better insight in what's going on in their
More
local
aware,
community.
yeah. Yeah. So how, just out of curiosity, how did you gather that information? Because, these entities, they are not like by default thinking like a business. There's definitely a business that they want to take care of. but it's not necessarily the first thought. Okay, how I'm going to collect this data? So how did you manage this?
That's primarily with the company that hired us, right? So they are the experts in this field already. They do economic development studies,
Okay,
feasibility studies for cities, kind of on a consulting basis. So they usually get hired to do
okay,
a site planning or just a feasibility of a local commercial area, essentially, and see, is it possible to attract new businesses here? How are we going to do that? Are there any grants that we can make available? They do some foot traffic data analysis, like how often do people go through this area? And so they have all these different data sources that they already use to provide these studies to complete this work that they do for cities. And they essentially make this now available at scale, is really what we did with this product. Because in some cases they have data sources that they pay for. In some cases, it's really just getting access to different public data sources, right? And bringing all that information together in this dashboard. And then doing their calculations and just doing some math to essentially track certain KPIs, to put in some guidelines, to put in some targets in some cases, and benchmarks in terms of what good looks like for cities, so that they have a good basic understanding of where to make these investments as a city.
got it. So one of the benefits is that, hey guys, you have a visual representation of all of that data. It's slice and dice, and then you have a trend lines, all these beautiful things. Like, what are the other decisions that the customer was making? Like how they benefited in their own decision making process using that data? Do you have any? Well, of course, this is government, so we don't ask to share anything that you don't want to. But if there's anything at the high level, what do they benefited with? Right, looking at this data.
Yeah, a lot of it is they just save themselves a lot of time, right? Because they need this data one way or another. So it kind of goes back to the RevOps thing. So they
Yep.
oftentimes go to different sources, collect them in some cases. For example, the real estate data, they need an MLS license. They typically don't have that. So they usually reach out to somebody that they know in their network that does have that. They can give them access to it. So they still have to pull all those pieces together. So that takes a lot of time, right? So there's usually quarterly reporting, annual reporting. That's usually when there's like an uptick in that request, right? And in that need for that data, because that's when the budgets get completed. That's when they need to apply for certain grants. Like all those things are kind of timed during the year, and they need to have that data. So that's one of the main things. Then number two is not every city, especially if you look at just Florida, where we're in right now, there is 400 some cities. Some are very large, a couple hundred thousands, but there's a lot of cities that have a population of, maybe 10,000 people, 20,000 people. It's very small. They don't have necessarily somebody in place to do their economic development there, right? So it lands on their city CEO and the city manager to do all that work, but they're also tasked with all these other things of running a city. So that's the other thing. They don't really have anybody to dissect all the data, to do the analysis, to come up with some insights, to come up with the learnings from the data. So that's what we provide in this as well, with the specific insights written for that city, that it becomes very consumable in terms of, you look at the data, you can slice and dice it, you can learn things on your own. But then there's also the insights that we provide that is written out in kind of long story format, literally saying, hey, look at this graph. You'll see that, because of the way the median rent price has been increasing in this very specific area, there might be an opportunity for you to, attract more commercial in this area or something like that, right? So we provide
Yeah.
those actual insights for city managers or for city staff, really, to make those decisions.
This is so meta because you help this service company build a product and help them get insights on their go to market and how they're pitching this product. And then the city managers are kind of like the RevOps people in the tech field, right? Like, and they're trying to figure out what is happening and what can we invest in and how do we change our go to market, and like think through that. So it's a super interesting use case. My assumption was you mostly work in the technology and SaaS field. Are you seeing that, like, is this letting you get into the public sector and do more there, or is my assumption wrong that it's not typically technology and SaaS that you're working with?
I feel anytime it's translatable, we will work on it. So that's also what I find really interesting about what we do, is because we're not tied to the one industry specifically. We work with some financial companies, some manufacturing companies. So it does kind of run the gambit in different industries, but the go to market is you still have to have an infrastructure, right? You still have to start with a strategy. You still have to have a growth model. If investments are made, you still have to be able to tie back where you invest money in the very start of the funnel of the revenue engine, essentially, or revenue factory, as a lot of people are now kind of describing that, right? You still want to make sure that the money that goes in gets spent in a way. You still want to make sure that the different channels where you deploy that money and investment still has an ROI. And I think that's just very translatable across different industries, even into the public sector. That's what I find really interesting to work on.
My wife has worked in nonprofit and government, and I obviously work in the technology field. Whenever I'm talking to her, I'm like, why aren't there tech products to do the stuff government does? Like, why, when I log on to the DMV website, is it so terrible? There's a tech product that would be so easily implemented to make this really easy for them to collect the data, to remember your information when you've lived in the same place forever, and like be able to like log into your profile where you can see all the services available. And often like government organizations have such a hard time getting the services taken advantage of. I'm like, there is a technology solution. So I'm excited that you guys are doing something there. And hopefully you see some more of that come in. One of the things that I would love to know a little bit more about is like, so you worked with a services company that wanted to create a product and you work with all different types of other tech products or whatever it may be. Like, what are you telling them they should be measuring with your services? Like, are you helping them figure out what is their return on investment for you guys coming in? Is it time savings? Like, what are you telling them to focus on with your services and whatever you're providing them?
Yeah, so you're asking
What is the benefit that your client should see essentially? You come and you say, "Hey, pay us $250,000 for this project." Like, yes, we'll get this done, but are you also saying, "And here what the outcome will be for implementing this?"
Yeah, we certainly try to provide as much as possible an ROI estimate at the beginning, also just to get the deal, to get the project, and to get the partnership with them. That is certainly something that we try to do at the beginning. It's hard because a lot of times it does come down to time savings, and that's not necessarily the
Hard
easiest
to
way
measure?
to sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to measure. It's hard to really put an ROI on that. It is usually a pretty compelling argument when they know that their VP of sales or CRO, and those are typically the people that we talk to, are happily bringing us in because they are happy to offload some of that work that they are doing that does not allow them to focus on what they were hired to do. So that is usually a pretty compelling argument to say, hey, look, you have a very expensive resource that is in the CRM running reports and doing these analytics that somebody else could do 10 times faster than you have this person do. So it does come down to time saving, but you can equate it to, hey, there's a very expensive resource that spends 20 hours a month on reporting. Is that really how you want them to spend their time?
You could basically take their salary, take the hours they work on it, and say, "This is how much you're paying for it." And even if you pay us the same amount, you're gonna get more from that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, probably it's not exactly one to one, but I would agree with the conclusion, right? That it's probably should be split some way. So, how did the collaboration work? You're working with some individuals already,
Mhm.
and this is government. So, was this having some challenges? You need to educate the partner. Hey, here's how it really works. If you want this to work, this is how you should be thinking about that, right? Because I think the collaboration is in this new area where people have a very little understanding how it could work. It's a little bit more hostile, right? So you have to find a way to explain, hey, look, I'm not an enemy here, right? I'm trying to help you, right? Which reminds me this phrase from a consulting firm, and the auditor is coming, walking to your to your company, and the first line is say, "I'm here to help you." So that's not what I'm referring to. But it's a really question about how did you collaborate with that entity, because that's a difficult thing to do, especially in the government. I mean, at the beginning of my career, I used to work in the government, and that was tough, right? When I saw somebody externally coming to me, I was just always like, stranger danger, had a reaction. So how did you overcome that?
Yeah, it was primarily something that our client overcame a little while ago, right? This person, as basically grown up in the public sector as a long background in working for cities and with city officials,
Has built that
and
trust
then also
already.
Yeah.
yeah, and also as an entrepreneur working with cities doing the consultancy that they've been doing that for a number of years now. And they hired us really to help them build the product, scale the product, and build the infrastructure to do so. So we don't necessarily speak to cities that much, but we do help them with kind of the sale process. But the founder of the company, he's an excellent salesperson himself too. So he understands the cities, he understands how they buy, how decisions get made. So a lot of that I would say has already been kind of established, and they
Mhm.
overcame that already a little while ago when they sold to cities as their consulting business. But they really brought us in to establish a new product and to scale that, and that's really where we help them succeed.
Pivoting back kind of to like the more broad spectrum of the RevOps and go-to-market services space, what do you see in terms of trends? Are you seeing that more and more companies are okay with fractional RevOps teams? Are you seeing that, you mentioned RevOps factories, like people are actually like understanding how important this is? Or what's kind of your sense of how things are going in the primarily like tech and B2B industry, but maybe outside of that too?
I think so. I think there's a lot more great content out there that people are consuming. I think it's not as new anymore. I think the director of RevOps is one of the fastest growing positions, I think in 23 and also this year, right? So before that, it really was sales operations, marketing operations, CS operations. RevOps is really kind of a new term that kind of came up in the last couple of years. But I do think now there's a lot more revenue operations professionals in the space. A lot of people are creating content around it and educating the market on it. I do think there's not that much more of the problem to educate the market in that way, right? Because there's a lot of that done already. And I do think now with the focus on profitability and sustainable growth, I do think especially early stage companies that get investments, Series A, Series B, there is more scrutiny on that. So I do think with all of that comes a higher need for revenue operations in companies like that. Because they do really have to make sure that the money they invest in different channels, they can just pour money into it and just grow, right? That time is over. That was a couple of years ago. Now it's much more focused on being profitable and having sustainable, repeatable growth. And to do that, I think companies are realizing we need something or someone, a team, kind of organizing the organization around that, building the infrastructure to do so, making sure that the data quality and the data infrastructure is built as well to track that and to make sure that we know what is working and what is not. So I do think the industry is moving to it. I do think there's more of a need for RevOps as a service specifically, I think as well, just because of the profitability piece to it, right? It's a lot more cost efficient, I think, instead of, the things that we just talked about, right? Instead of hiring all the people internally or instead of kind of divvying up the work in your internal team, I think it makes a lot more sense for companies to spend a little bit and get essentially all the RevOps experts at a fractional basis. And with that too, we see a lot of fractional CROs being deployed also, kind of on the flip side of that with companies, instead of companies hiring a full-time CRO or VP of sales. So we see that also, and fractional VP of marketing or CMOs also. So I do think that whole model is a little bit more accepted and welcomed these days.
Yeah, you could have a really like fat go-to-market team and kind of poor go-to-market strategy when so much money was flowing into the tech businesses. And now it's like you got to nail it. Like there's not a lot of room for error. And so having outside resources that can help you figure that out without having a team of, 10 product marketing people trying to sort it out and partnering with RevOps, it's makes a lot of sense to be seeing so many service businesses popping up and trying to help there.
Think about this whole RevOps fever in the context of how many people were doing a part of RevOps and now they just claiming they do RevOps.
Yep.
I saw those spectacular changes on the LinkedIn. Somebody was doing sales operations, now is doing RevOps. Wait, you got promoted? I agree that this is probably the one of the fastest growing titles, but at the same time, I think it was a territory for grab, and a lot of people just claim the territory that it doesn't belong to them,
Yep.
having a very little experience in some of these areas. But of course, because it's a keyword and it looks better, suddenly all these careers changed.
So
Yes, I understand everyone is trying to market themselves, I get it. But I think that was probably a little bit too much. If you were doing campaigns and marketing operations, that's marketing operations. That is a part of RevOps. Yes, you are part of RevOps, but that's not what your job is. So this term has broadened a little bit, but I think at the same time, it broadened a little bit artificially because of that. What I'm trying aiming at is there's a limited number of people actually who've done
Can
RevOps.
do it.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And right now, we're even seeing that kind of evolving even more into go to market ops, GTM ops. So we're seeing now as well. As people are even flipping from RevOps to GTM ops because it's even more broad. Not entirely sure where that goes, but I agree. RevOps is not the same as sales ops. Having been in both, having led sales operations departments as well as revenue operations departments, it is certainly a different expertise. Revenue operations really is marketing, sales, and CS combined, where sales operations is a very specific role, really that falls within RevOps, right? And like you said, marketing ops falls within RevOps, and CS ops falls within RevOps. And then underneath that, there's or not underneath it, but kind of on the same level, there's all the other tasks that needs to be done in sales and marketing that there's often a specialist for each of these roles, right? And especially the larger the organization is, the more you're going to have specialists doing one particular part of that role. But I do think RevOps on a leadership level, it needs to be somebody that has experience kind of in all components of the go-to-market and needs to have that visibility kind of from above to kind of steer the whole organization in the right direction. And kind of on the same token, we see that also with a lot of CROs that we speak to, that kind of the same evolution, right? They were a VP of sales, but then they either got promoted or they just named themselves or,
Yeah.
they just acquired a different title as CRO. But a true CRO, they're not that easy to find, I think. A lot of CROs we speak to, they're really VPs of sales.
Yeah.
They are very commercially driven, pretty narrowly focused on the sales organization and not necessarily having that marketing expertise or the customer success part of that role, which is also critically important for a successful CRO.
So let me ask you a follow-up question on this. Do you think that there will be more ops or RevOps people becoming CROs in the future?
I think it's a pretty good path for a RevOps to grow into a CRO role. And I think as a CRO, it's a pretty good pedigree or pretty good skill set to have a background in revenue operations, yes. Because typically RevOps already has that kind of broad spectrum experience across the organization, across the entire go-to-market engine that I think lends itself very well to be a CRO because they're typically very data driven, they're operational, they look at what's working, what's not. They're typically very unbiased, which I think a good CRO is as well. And they're not really leaning towards making investments just sales or just marketing or just CS if they come from that part of the organization.
It's funny as we're talking about this, I'm like, huh, RevOps and partnerships are really similar, right? Because my experience as in being in partnerships is you have to figure out, okay, how do we work with marketing for this partner? How do we figure out how that we enable sales with this? What is the operational setup for this? How do CS people work with partners? Like you have to have the broad spectrum. And it is really, really, really hard to find a good partnerships leader, like someone that can do all of this. And typically they get in through one of those channels and has to learn the rest of it. And I'm just like, oh, no wonder we get along, Demetrius. We both have to do the same thing, which is fascinating. But I think the CROs, the ones that weren't great, they were very sales focused. And that leads to a really tough relationship with product often and with operations teams. And I think if you can have someone who has some sales experience, like I think that is important because it is part of it, or CS experience, but then goes down the operations path and comes back. God, what a dream it would be to have a CRO that has that background. It's just a way different mindset and holistic mindset.
Yeah, but I think there are some trade-offs. Definitely, you will need to let go big chunk of your tactical work that you do in RevOps to become a CRO and acquire that more opportunistic thinking in your day-to-day job. But at the core, you're still going to use your analytical skill set and your ability to allocate resources, which I think are getting you closer to work with the CFO at that point.
Yep.
Your story becomes more cohesive and you start speaking the language of other functions at that level. Let's be honest. If you listen to any investor relations call, what do they talk about?
The money.
Right? Exactly. So that's what really matters. That's how a lot of compensation will be defined in the company because you know how to talk about money, you know what the money is, and you can tell people where the money going to find in the future. If you're not able to do this, you're not a good CFO, which is obvious, CEO as well, and then anyone else who's on this call is a CRO, I don't know, whoever. You need to be fluent with that. You might not be an expert, but fluent. But it's a trade-off. There's definitely a trade-off, and I think the RevOps will be thrown in the hat more often. I'm not saying it's going to be dominant because I can't foresee that, but depending on the stage of the company, depending on the size of the company, the industry, etc., I think it will be somewhere in the mix.
I want to switch gears a little bit. As I mentioned, we talk to tech companies all the time, and a lot of go-to-market startups and AI-driven companies. And I'm curious, as you're helping to set up go-to-market strategies and the kind of the toolkit that these companies are using, how are you thinking about the like go-to-market tech revolution we're in right now? Like all these new players coming in and AI being used. I'm sure you have like a core set of this CRM and the kind of the mainstays, but are you expanding into some of those newer tools as well?
Yeah. And I think we kind of have to in a lot of ways to be more efficient and to better allocate the resources that we have, and AI certainly can help with that. I will say the evolution that we've been seeing in the last couple of years, really since 2018, right when kind of marketing automation systems were kind of like widely deployed, we're just seeing a huge uptick in outreach, right? And it's just sending a lot of messages. And I feel like that just created a huge problem that we're seeing now where you see the debates on LinkedIn every day. Outreach is dead. Is it dead or not? Does outreach still make sense? Does cold calling make sense? Does sending an email make sense at all? Are people even reading them? And you'll see it in your own inbox too. You get so many emails, you get bombarded every day, and the message quality is not great, right? And I think the kind of the rise of AI makes it even easier now to just blast messages into your contact list without really having any relevance or any personalization or anything that really makes people want to read that message and get any value out of it. I do think AI can certainly help with that if done well. We're not really seeing that at the moment. So I do think that will take a little bit of time. I think people will try to find their footing and kind of get some more experience with it. But there's some great companies that certainly help with that. I think I like all the stuff that Copy AI is doing. They are kind of a great example of how this can be deployed in a very intelligent way. I think companies like Clay, for example, could potentially also help with this, with a lot of the account research. I think that's where AI can certainly help, right? With doing a lot of the tasks that takes a person a very long time to do. So reading annual reports, right? Reading or listening to investor publications, right? And all of that information, to dissect all of that and tie that back to why that is important for your ICP and CEO interviews, right? So sales calls, for example, AI can just essentially go through all this transcriptions and come up with like certain information points that takes a person very long to kind of find, right? And tie that back to what are we selling? What need do we really solve for our ICP? And how are we going to kind of deliver that message in an intelligent way at the right time when they are looking for a potential solution for their problems? And yes, it will help as SDRs, will help the sales team with account research. It will help the marketing team with messaging and creating content and campaigns around this. So I do think there's a time and place for it, and we do see some great examples. We also see a lot of bad examples, unfortunately, and that does make it harder, I think, for everyone to do
Yeah.
effective outreach.
If anyone has listened to this podcast before, this is a topic that me and Demetrius don't shut up about. It's all the emails we get in our inbox that are like, oh, it's not personalized at all. And so that's like the bad use case. I think you kind of nailed what is going really well. We talked to Lerno yesterday. That's like a product marketer's dream because it's just aggregating all of the data, giving you real insights into what you can do with that. And that's what I think is the exciting part of it.
Well, Lizzie, I think we should kick off the kind of counter, how many times we hear this, and just count this every single time. And that should be on the pod as well on our website.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, Paul, very, very quickly, I follow up on this one. Do you think that the AI might accelerate this whole process of fractional hiring in RevOps because of these tools enabling so many people and they can operate as an individual consultant?
That's a great question. It does change a lot of roles, I think, within organizations, right? I think a lot of people will now get hired to essentially be the pilot, almost the engineer behind all of this, right? There's a lot of data that companies have access to, a lot of data that gets acquired, as well as internal data that I think with the right mindset, the right skill set, people that can deploy AI intelligently within a company, within an organization, they will kind of become that person behind the scenes that navigates everything, essentially, right? That works on the data and makes sure that everything kind of comes together. I'm not sure if that will change really the way people go fractional or not. I do think more can be done with less, right? So you don't necessarily need a specialist in every single role full time to have a successful go-to-market organization and go-to-market engine. So in that sense, I do think since the roles changed a little bit, I do think there might be, a better platform for having these roles essentially fractional as opposed to full-time in-house.
Yeah. I'm like, so obviously we do this podcast for a reason, but so excited to see the trends and what's happening both on the tech side and how do people go and implement these and figure it out on the services side. You called out a couple of companies, Copy and Clay. I'm dying to get Clay on. I can't wait to talk to them. So that's one we hear all the time. Anyone else you want to give a shout out to, whether it's a tech product in the go-to-market space or even other service shops that maybe you work with and partner with?
I love all the stuff that this company Growblocks puts out in terms of content. They're very forward with their kind of revenue operations thinking. So I like a lot of things that they bring out. Their products is great too. It's essentially a go-to-market. Well, it was like an infrastructure dashboard. I'm kind of botching this. So they will do a much better job at
We'll
pitching
need to
their
have them
service,
on. They'll do a great job. Yeah.
Yeah, but essentially it pulls in all the data from all the different departments, and it essentially helps you track where you need to invest, where things are going wrong. Does some predictive modeling as well in terms of, hey, if we add another salesperson here, what will that look like in 6 months from now? Should we worry about that? Can we double down, make some additional investments here? What does ramp time look like? So it essentially takes all of the go-to-market metrics and lays that out in one tool for people to manage. So it's a perfect tool for anyone in RevOps, I think, to manage all of the different components and essentially say, oh, you need to pay attention here, here, and here, make some additional investments here, here, and here. And it's just a great tool to kind of visualize all of that for you.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, another one we'll have to have on. And did you prepare top 3 tips that you want to give?
Yeah, top 3 tips. And this is really just for just general effective revenue operations, right? And it kind of comes down to the basics, in my opinion. So I'm not really sharing anything new necessarily, but just prioritize data hygiene because that is critical. And the more data we acquire and the more people are touching the data that are not necessarily RevOps, but all in the organization, clean, accurate data is really so important for an effective revenue operations strategy and a go-to-market strategy. And then number 2 is the alignment of all teams, all go-to-market teams, essentially, that work in the go-to-market strategy, aligned around a shared and common revenue goal. I think that's really important too. So right now we're in planning mode, almost, right? September, October, so it's usually when annual plans get made up. I think revenue operations there as well as a critical role of meeting with all of the different departments, getting all of the assumptions in the plan built out, and then bringing everybody together and saying, is this a plan that we can align around? Is this a plan that everybody signs off on? And that way, everybody knows exactly how each of the metrics, KPIs, OKRs, however it is being tracked, how all of that ties to one growth goal at the end of it. So all of that needs to tie together. And I think revenue operations is just in a perfect position, centralized in the company to share that, but also to put that together and work with all the different department heads to come up with a centralized revenue goal. So I think that's critical that revenue operations does and gets really good at as well. The third one is really just invest in the right tools and training. This is easier said than done, right? I think it's very easy to acquire a tool. It's not that easy to make the right decision on which tool you need and how that's going to play into your overall go-to-market architecture and infrastructure.
I love it.
Right.
Those are great tips.
I agree with all of them. Yeah.
Well, Paul, it was great to have you on to kick off our first services episode. So we really appreciate you coming and chatting with us.
Yeah.
Thanks,
No,
Paul.
it's great. Yeah, it's a good conversation. I like it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the RevTech Podcast. Please subscribe on the listening platform of your choice and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing.